welcome everyone. And this week's webinar is around risk management. So center your compliance around strong risk management. My name is Shanna Rasmussen and I'm a business development director. And with me today, I have our head of customer success, Morten Christensen. Hello, Morten.
Hi.
So before we get started, let's just quickly introduce ourselves and talk you through the agenda, and then we will show you Impero. So Morten, perhaps you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah, I can do so. Thank you for that, Shannon. My name is Morten Christensen. I'm heading our customer success department here at Impero, meaning that in general, my team has the responsibility for all of our clients and a few of our prospects as well, meaning that we know a whole lot about the Impero solution and the different use cases, and I'll also be the one guiding you through today's webinar.
Thank you, Morten. And as for myself, as I said, my name is Shanna. I'm a business development director, very much focusing on potential client, but also our existing clients and the optimal use of the system. The reason being, I bring a background as both a consultant, an auditor, and a finance accountant. So my focus has always been heavily around revolving around risk management and how you can basically integrate that into your day-to-day operations. And that's essentially what we want to showcase for you today. I, at least for myself, know from firsthand experience that it can be very difficult for organizations to have a common understanding of your risk landscape. Also, even using the same risk methodology and terminology across countries, across departments, across entities. So Impero, we can really demonstrate today how Impero can help you underpin this and really embed it into your day-to-day operations, making sure that you're using the same framework, so to say. So in a while, Morten will basically show you how you can set up these risk directories, how you can identify and evaluate risks across your organization. And it's important to say here that we're not only talking, say, for example, financial risks or tax risks. It can be any risks that you are exposed to within your organization. So really getting this common understanding of your entire risk landscape. Morten will also show you how you can basically manage these risks, how you can link them to mitigating actions within Impero, and also how you can effectively have your user administration set up so that you only have people seeing what they should be seeing. And last but not least, we'll be showing you a few of the customized risk maps that we have prepared within Impero. This is just to basically underpin that it's a really, really flexible solution that we can tailor to whatever framework you have. So during the next half an hour, roughly, you have the ability to ask questions. We will answer them as and when we go along, but we'll also hold time at the end to answer any questions that we haven't had time to during the demo. So a technical demo today, really about how to set up and how to use Impero for risk management. Morten, can you take it away, please?
Yes, I can do so. Thank you for that. So I'll just dive into Impero. Essentially, I'll actually just sign in here using my username, and password. We of course also support single sign-on and multi-factor authentication. It's not applied for this environment here, but that's also something that you can opt in on. So essentially, what we see here is Impero. We'll of course mainly be focusing around the risk management section for today, and a few different use cases around here. We'll very briefly talk about control management, but only to basically show, well, how does a mitigating action actually look and how it's designed, but very briefly talk a bit about access rights and user rights in our user management as well. So let's get started. Let's dive into the risk management section here. So Talking about risk management in Impero, there are a few different sections. First off, we are basically now in our overview, but we actually also have an entity tab, and I'll just like to actually start here. And so now you can of course see that there are some entities here that has already been created. Otherwise, it's fairly easy to actually create a new one. Just use this one here as an example. So an entity within risk management will consist of a name, a description, there will be a responsible user, and then we can basically provide the access rights to this specific entity here. So let's just add a new one here and say, well, we actually have let's just say a local user who only has access to this single entity that we actually have here. This doesn't mean that, well, that as you saw in the overview here, that there are only one. There can be multiple. But when this user accesses Impero, and I'll show you later on how that looks, then this user can actually only see whatever he or she has been granted access to. So this is sort of the first step, defining well, which entities are in scope, and who should actually have access to that. And we have a few different kinds of access rights. I'll not dive that much in detail with it, but you can also see them here. We have the admins can of course do edit all the stuff. I'll show you what you can do here. You can also grant others access, which is why I was able to add a new user. If you had edit access, you can edit, but you can't grant other access. And if you have a view, then you can see everything, but you basically can't edit and do anything. So this is sort of the first step. The second step is then to actually get started essentially on designing your risk map, and it's basically divided into two different sections. So we have what we call the risk directory. This is where we create the overview, the processes, sub-processes, the risks, and we assign them to the entities that we have defined here in our entity tab. And then we have the assessment section, basically, where we can say, well, okay, how do we actually assess these risks here? But I'll get a bit back to that later on as well. So let's just very briefly see how do we actually design this in Impero. And of course, now you can see, zoom in a bit here, that there are a few predefined processes here, but you can essentially create your own that matches the scope and the framework that you are using. We can just use finance here as an example, but as Jana already mentioned, this is not only a finance solution or only a tax solution. This can be used quite broadly. Within the finance process here, that could be even a subdivision here by adding in a sub process here, but otherwise in the end we can do a risk here. A risk in Impero consists of a name. Now I'll just label this one here. Financial one. We can also do a description. We can even do a scope, and I'll get a little bit back to that. And then there's a lot of, or some at least, metadata here, and our out-of-the-box solution. It's financial statement assertions and its objectives. And this part here can basically be tailored into the framework that you're using. Maybe your assertions looks a bit different, then we can match that. Maybe you have some different parameters that you'd also like to report upon, then we can also do that. So this is basically where we populate the risk. We create it, we sort of assign all the metadata to the risk that we need, and then we can jump to the entity tab, and we can basically say, okay, where does this risk here actually apply? And now this has already been assigned to Impero AS, Impero SE. We could also add in that it's also applicable for Impero DK, for instance. And then that's basically it. Of course, we can do that. We can do the run through of all of our risks, and we can upload these and push them to all of our different entities. The next section, and I'll just go back to the risk management overview here, is then the actual assessment part. And now I'll just show you how does this actually look from an admin perspective that has access to multiple entities. So if you recall in the entity tab, then I actually have access to all of the entities that we see. So now this is actually the same view that what we had before. As you can see, we have our newly created risks, but you can also see that it's actually populated here 3 times, one for each of the entities that we assigned this risk to here. If we just do Impero DK here as an example, then we can see all of the data that was provided centrally. I can't edit it from this view here. However, what I can do is that I can say, okay, what's the actual inherent impact and likelihood? So basically my inherent risk assessment here. By default, our out-of-the-box solution here, it's a 5x5 scale where the impact goes from very low to very high. The likelihood goes from remote to nearly certain. Again, this can be tailored into the framework that you are using. Maybe you have spent quite some time on doing an Excel model or similar already. Then we can basically adapt to that, not only in the scale, but also by adding in either some equations or a few additional drop downs. As stated in the agenda, we'll provide a few examples of that in the end as well. But let's move along and try to do an assessment here and say, well, maybe the impact is high and maybe the likelihood here is highly likely. Then our next task is basically to do a response. Now, from when we assign these risks, we can actually also do it on a process level, meaning that we can mass assign these risks to multiple entities as one, so you don't have to evaluate each and every one of your risk. This will turn the workflow a little bit and say, well, then I can actually be now in Impero DK and I can say, okay, I can see that we have been assigned to this risk here, but it's actually not a risk that we're exposed to. Then I can say, well, it's not applicable. It might be different when we're doing the reassessment. So it's fine to have it in the overview. Otherwise, I can transfer it, maybe using insurance or something like that. We could try to say, well, we are familiar with the risk, but we try to avoid it. Maybe we accept the risk. Maybe either it's too costly or it's too low, so it actually doesn't make sense for us to do anything about it. The most commonly used, at least in Impero, of course, is that, well, we actually want to reduce this risk here. And as soon as I select reduce, you will see this little subsection here where I can basically add my first off my mitigating action, and second off I can actually do my residual assessment here. So let's just add a control here. Let's just use a classic bank reconciliation here as an example. I can see the title and the basic description. I'll show you very briefly afterwards here how this control actually looks, but we just see the basic details here on the screen. Of course, I can add multiple mitigating actions to this risk here, and this control here can also mitigate multiple risks. Afterwards, as I've already mentioned, I can do my residual impact and likelihood. Maybe the impact is still the same, but the likelihood has now been reduced to unlikely. And what this actually means is that I can see here in our heat map here, if we just look at Impero DK here, then I can see, okay, we are exposed to 3 risks that has been assessed already. I can see them in the heat map here. This is the inherent view, and then I can toggle back and forward between my residual and inherent view. So I basically get my overview of, well, what's the risk if we don't do anything? What are we actually doing to mitigate this risk? And then what's our residual view in this aspect here?
Brilliant. Thank you, Morten. So at a high level, what Morten has basically showcased you for now is that we have the ability to identify all of the risks that we are exposed to within a given area, whether that is enterprise-wide or whether it's, for example, within a specific topic. And once that is done, and that could, for example, be done at a group level, we then have the ability to push them out to each of the individual entities or departments, or however you want to structure your organization, for the people who knows the business the best to then perform an evaluation that can then be consolidated back to the group again. And you then have a nice and simple visual to make sure that you have addressed your risks based on your needs. So Morten, we now have, say, entities who would like to report their own risks as well. You briefly spoke about scoping before, but maybe you can dive a bit more into that.
Yeah, so now we and the risk we just did before, if you recall, and we actually did this at a global risk that goes to multiple entities. You know, I've actually just swap user here for the purpose of actually answering that. So let's just dive in here. Hold on 1 second, because I have some different access rights here. So now I am, if you recall back, on my local user. As you can see, the dashboard here, it looks a bit different. And also, if I go into my risk management section here, it would also look a little bit different. So now I can, if I go to the entity tab here, I can only see the one entity that we actually assigned the local user here for before. And now this is being used in multiple risk map here, but I'll just dive into the view that we actually had before. And all I can see here in this view here is actually risks that are assigned to the company that I have the right access rights to do. So this means that these are risks that I actually need to do something about. What it also means, back to your question, Shannon, is that within the risk directory here, so we can just do the finance process here, I can actually also add a risk, but I only have access to a single entity. So what I can do here when I create a new risk here is, as you can see, I can create a global risk. I can actually only create a local risk. So this here means that I can actually only create a risk that applies for my entity. So meaning that, well, the view that we were in before, we could say, well, we do some, these are the risks that we need to assign to all of our companies, we can do that. But then we actually have one maybe in this case here in Impero AS, it says, okay, we actually have an additional set of local risks that we also need to apply in order to actually get the full picture. So that means that this risk here, and then we can just do a local risk. One here as an example, I can only assign it to this one entity. Of course, if I had access to multiple, I could create local risks for these, but either way, I wouldn't be able to create a global risk. In my overview here, I can see that, well, I have a mix now of global risks and local risks. Now I label this local risk, but otherwise we also mark it with this location pointer here, so you can actually see that it's a local risk. The same goes for when you're actually assessing the risks afterwards. Then we can see, well, we have these risks here. These are global risks. These are corporate risks that has been applied for this entity here. But I also have some local risks that only applies for either my country or my entity.
Brilliant. So in very basic terms, you have the ability from a group level to push down risks for evaluation by the individual entity, and likewise you have the ability to report back up from the local entity in case they, for example, believe that the risk landscape is incomplete, or in case they would even want to just say maintain their own local risk landscape that may not be relevant at a group level, but they still want to maintain that within Impero. So this way we have the ability to create basically a full and complete risk landscape across the organization, across all of the entities, departments, processes, etc., that we are evaluating. And likewise, we have the ability to assign mitigating actions to make sure that they are being addressed appropriately. And these mitigating actions, we won't be going into details with that today. That will come up at a later webinar where we will jump into the control management module. However, you basically have the ability to perform these mitigating actions and report the progress on these in our reporting module. So Morten, you've said a couple of times now that it's a flexible solution. You have the ability to tailor-make all of these risk directories and risk maps to match your own framework. Perhaps you can show us a couple of examples what that could look like.
Yeah, so I'll just first off just show very briefly what it actually looks like out of the box. Just once again here and say, well, this is actually just the default view. Fairly easy to get started. We use a 5x5 scale, and again, very easy, very quickly to get started. However, if you, depending on where you are on the maturity scale, then you might actually have put some effort into this already and say, well, this all looks fine. However, we need a few additional parameters in order to actually meet our requirements. And we are very, very flexible in this manner. Essentially, all of what you see, not the title, not the description, and not the scope and entity, these we need, but the rest can either be removed or modified into basically the framework that you are using, as I mentioned. So I'll just jump back here to the PowerPoint presentation and just show this is basically another example here. So it's exactly the exact same engine that this here actually applies for, or that this solution here actually runs upon. It's just been divided a little bit different. So now you can see that we actually have a reputational risk, we have a financial risk. Then we actually calculated, well, based on these inputs here, we do a suggested impact, and then we can manually evaluate the impact likelihood scale afterwards. Now it's very high and nearly certain here. And based on the values that we have put into our impact and likelihood scale here, we actually calculate a risk score. Now this is the maximum value here, so it equals a risk score of 100. And we also have some information about a process owner. So this is one example, and as you can see, there are here, I think, 5 additional informations, and it's not that it's limited to 5 or to 10. We can actually do basically whatever is needed, but it's just to give you a bit of perspective and a bit of an idea of how powerful we actually are, and how adaptable we are to actually meet the requirements that you have. Let's dive into another example here as well. Again, this is exactly the same. Now this is just this is actually just within tax as well, but now we have some information about region, country, strategic impact, operational impact, compliance, reputational, financial impact, and so on. Here we have a few input fields here that we can provide as well. What I want to show here with this example here is that the inherent impact, I don't know if you can see it, but it's actually grayed a bit out here. So this means that now the inherent impact is not something that we actually set manually. This is actually something that will be automatically calculated based on other input fields. In this case here, it's just a weighted average between the 5 other impact scales that we see here. So we can do a lot here, and it's actually something that we tend to spend quite some time on in the onboarding process with new clients as well, because it's very powerful and it's not limited. So if we jump back to Impero here, it's not, if you say, well, that's fine to get started, but we are on a journey where we might want some additional measures as well, then we can actually also do that and adapt to the future as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Morten. So we have one question being, can we export the risk registers to our auditors?
Yeah, so essentially, now it's actually hidden behind an input box here, but up here we can, export. I found it. We can do an export. What this does here is that it basically exports what you see here. I can actually toggle to a list view of the same risk here. Maybe I want some additional measures or be able to see something else in my table view here, and I can do the export here. And we will also export the mitigating controls along with the description and the design of those as well. So that can be done either now on my local user, so either from a local perspective, but also from a global perspective from a user that has access to multiple entities.
Thank you. And in addition to that, we also always recommend you to give your auditors access to the risk module, so they have the ability to just get a view access, so they can't do any harm. They can just basically see what you believe your risk assessment looks like. Brilliant. So that was today's a bit more of a technical webinar as to how you can set up these risk registers and how you can evaluate your risks. So basically on Thursday, the 18th of November at 1:30 p.m. Danish time, we'll host our next webinar, which will give you a bit more of a, say, holistic introduction to the entire platform. So like we were mentioning today, what you haven't seen is our control management module and our reporting module, which is, of course, important to make sure that you are actually addressing these risks in a timely manner and in the intended way. So feel free to basically join us next week. And if the timing doesn't work, you also have the ability to log onto our website and see previously recorded webinars around the control management module and the reporting module. We hope you found today's session insightful and helpful, and we are looking forward to welcoming you to our next webinar. So thank you.
Thank you for your time.